During the summer of 1908, a University of Pittsburgh botany professor was collecting plant samples at Cedar Point, Ohio, when a colleague suggested he shift his study efforts to Presque Isle in Erie, Pennsylvania. Dr. Otto E. Jennings traveled to Presque Isle the following summer and began a 50-year tenure on the peninsula. Now, during his time there, Jennings discovered, documented, and dated the impact of Presque Isle's unique style of succession on the peninsula. He also shifted his professional focus from plant gathering to sandspit geology. Jennings brought colleagues, including his wife Grace, who was also a biologist, to Presque Isle. He built a research station in the park's interior and initiated a system of overall biological studies of Presque Isle as he worked to preserve the park and its plant life. His work, which cataloged and dated Presque Isle's early formation as well as its plant, aquatic, insect, and animal life, stands as the monument to the scientific study of and continued protection of the peninsula. It also explains the force that has been at work, systematically growing Presque Isle from west to east. Here to review that fateful summer of 1908 and the 50 years that followed during Jennings' tenure and more is Dr. David Frew, Jefferson Educational Society Scholar in Residence, in another installment of the Accidental Paradise digital programming series. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagat. I'm the Vice President at the JES and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. 194 pages, full color, hardcover, dust jacket and all. Accidental Paradise, a 13,000-year history of Presque Isle. The recently published book features Presque Isle's natural history and colorful political history, including its creation as a state park in 1921, but also a lot of folks who made a lot happen on that park. Notably, Dr. Otto Jennings. An important note up front here, folks, published by the JES in cooperation with the Tom Ridge Environmental Center Foundation. I do want to thank the folks at Trek for their partnership in this process. For more information on how, where, and when to purchase the book, please visit the website that the Trek has created for this, accidentalparadise.com. Joining me here, as mentioned, is one of the book's co-authors, Dr. David Frew. He is a scholar in residence at the JES. An emeritus professor at Yale University, he held a variety of administrative positions during a 33-year-long career. He's also the emeritus director of the Erie County Historical Society, the Hagen History Center, where he had previously served as the executive director for 5 years and is president of his own management consulting business. He's co-authored or authored 40 books, including Accidental Paradise, which brings us here together for this conversation, as well as more than 100 articles, cases, and papers, including his prolific On the Waterfront series for the JES. For a fuller and much deserving bio, head over to our website, jeserie.org. Now, folks, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're watching or listening to a later broadcast, still send us those questions, those comments to keep the conversation going. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES programs and publications, do visit our website, jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. David Frew, thank you for coming back again and joining us for this new conversation.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone who's interested in Presque Isle.
Terrific, sir. If you give me 1 second, I'm going to pull up that PowerPoint. Folks, we are going to go through that. Dr. Frew is going to work us through. There we go. Work us through this. So again, we're going to take your questions, your comments in the comment section of the Facebook post. So we will go ahead and get started. We're going to get to those at the end. So Dr. Frew, let's talk about that. That was in the introduction, the force that has created Presque Isle. We're going to get to that. But Otto Jennings, here we are. Tell us about him, sir.
Well, Otto Jennings was a botanist from the University of Pittsburgh, and he essentially discovered the force. And Star Wars analogies are appropriate here. We all go to Presque Isle, we all drive around, we all see what we see, and we all do what we do. We fish, we hike, we swim, we picnic, but maybe we don't notice succession or understand it or its importance with respect to the creation and the continued stability of Presque Isle. And that's what Otto Jennings called our attention to. And any discussion of the force on Presque Isle begins with the anchor species on Presque Isle and other sand spits. That would be true of ocean sand spits as well, and that's the lowly eastern cottonwood tree. There you see a classic example there. In fact, a whole bunch of examples. And if you drive around the peninsula and you start to pay attention to what cottonwoods look like, you'll see that they're everywhere, especially on the edges. If we could go to the next slide, Ben. This time of year, you'll notice that the cottonwood leaves start to shed their snow. So one of the things that happens around Erie, Pennsylvania in early June, late May and early June, depends upon the weather that year, is that the leaves change from looking as they do on the left, those are the cottonwood trees as they generally exist, to looking like they do on the right. And those snowy things are seed pods. And as the wind picks up on a nice early or late spring, early summer day in June, those things will start to fly around town and create chaos. So for those of us that have had the experience of rolling the third coat of stain on our deck and then waking up the next morning and finding a couple of 100,000 of these little white seeds stuck in there, or varnishing the deck or the teak on a sailboat and seeing the same, we sometimes get mad at those things, but we don't appreciate their role in the creation of Presque Isle. And that's what Otto Jennings was calling our attention to. So moving along to the next slide, right around Presque Isle and take a look. Cottonwoods are everywhere. They come in big and small and medium sizes, but the thing that we'll notice as we start to watch them is they don't last long. They don't have the long life of a maple or an oak or even an ash. They're designed to grow up quickly and to collapse and rot in place and provide a substructure for other species. That's part of the mystery and the force of succession. Next slide, Ben. Lake Erie is fortunate to have its direction be almost identical to the prevailing winds. So Lake Erie runs from southwest to northeast longitudinally. And because it does so, there are sandspit peninsulas here. There are 5 that are notable, some little teeny ones that we won't mention, but the notable ones are as follows. On the Canadian side at Pelee, which is right across the lake from the Lake Erie Islands, is Pelee Point, which is a Canadian national park. It's a fabulous place. I highly recommend a visit as soon as they open the borders up, if we ever open up the borders. Sooner or later, I'm confident that will happen. And that's an incredible place. It's quite like Presque Isle, except that instead of being at an angle and running along the edge of the lake like Presque Isle does, it sort of sticks straight out. So if you have an opportunity to do a Google map of the lake, you'll see Pelee Point sticks out, and in the middle of the lake across from it toward the American side is Pelee Island. And then there are all the American islands. Moving along to the next sand spit, and this is also in Canada, and not too far east of Pelee is Rondeau, which is an Ontario provincial park, and another quite exciting place. It's a little bit more oriented like Presque Isle is, and yet it's sort of a place that's not as connected to succession as Presque Isle or Long Point. Rondeau is a lovely place, also a highly recommended stop. And this is the place we talked about a couple programs ago, where you can drive out to the beginning of the park and actually park your vehicle in a giant parking lot at a place which would be a smaller version of our Trek, their welcome center. And from there, cars are not allowed. You can walk the rest of the way or ride the rest of the way on a bike or get a tram ride, but the rest of the park is closed to traffic. The third important sand spit on Lake Erie is Long Point, and that's essentially the peninsula, which is quite like Presque Isle, and immediately across the lake from Presque Isle. In fact, Early on, we mentioned that these guys are sand cousins because of the geology of the lake, the more massive amounts of sand that fall on Long Point, which is why it's larger than Presque Isle, used to at least somehow float across the moraine and land on Presque Isle and be controlled by the Pennsylvania Channel. You might want to go back and reference that in the earlier programs. But here's a picture of Long Point. Long Point is exactly like Presque Isle in the sense that it has ridges. It's a succession sand spit. It has 6 ridges. It's about 3 times as big as Presque Isle. And since it's 3 times as big as Presque Isle, the features there are 3 times as high. So while the largest sand ridges, succession ridges on Presque Isle are 30, 35 feet, sometimes maybe 40, there are ridges on Long Point that are well over 100 feet tall. And the other interesting and most notable thing about Long Point is it's sort of stuck in the wilderness area of Ontario. There was not much habitation over there. And just after the Civil War, 20 people, 10 Americans and 10 Canadians bought Long Point. They originally intended it as a sort of a wilderness area that they were going to protect from their private duck hunting club at the base, which they still have. There are still 20 people that own Long Point. However, bowing to some environmental pressures, they've given a good bit of it to be managed to the federal government and another good bit to be managed by the provincial government. And 10 or 12 years ago, the United Nations identified Long Point as a biosphere preserve. So you can't go there, you can't drive around. There is no admission out there. If you get caught, going there on a boat, you'll be gently asked to leave. If you don't leave quickly, you'll be arrested, put in handcuffs, and taken to an Ontario prison where you'll probably be treated pretty nicely and released. But there's no trespassing out there. I had the good fortune to spend about 20 years hanging out on Long Point in the summer with my friend Dave Stone, who I wrote a book with or two. And Dave had an archaeological permit, so we were allowed to go out there. Next interesting sand spit is Cedar Point. And the title of this slide is Cedar Point, a Cautionary Tale. Much more population at the base of Cedar Point than there has ever been at any of these other sand spits. And that's what's led to it becoming what we know of today as a massive amusement park. Good that it happened there and maybe not at Presque Isle and not at Long Point. Otherwise, we would have lost that to whatever. And this is where we find Otto Jennings in 1908. And he was inclined to go there because he himself was from Firelands, Ohio, which wasn't far from Cedar Point. And he would take his summers off from University of Pittsburgh and go there to do field work. Primarily, he was interested in planting or gathering plants. And there he was gathering plants at the place that was close to his home when somebody said, if you want to go to a place where you can gather a whole lot of different plants without having to walk as far, because succession happens in such a compressed area on Presque Isle, as it also does on Long Point, you really ought to try going to Presque Isle, which would make some sense for you since you're a University of Pittsburgh professor. University of Pittsburgh is in Pennsylvania, so you should be able to make a connection here. So in 1909, Otto Jennings shows up at Presque Isle to collect plants. Next slide. Here's Otto Jennings to give you a contextual perspective. He lived from 1867 to 1964. He was a tenured professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and he was also given the directorship of the Carnegie Museum. He would have been, in effect, not the managing administrative director, but the equivalent of the orchestra director, the guy that figured out what to do at the museum. Yeah, he treated that museum, I guess, in the way that I treated my time when I was at the Erie County Historical Society running museums. I wasn't a museum director by trade or a historian, but I played one at work and had a lot of fun for 5 years. Next slide. Well, as he was wandering around there, discovering the advantages of gathering plants on Presque Isle, it occurred to him that what he was seeing was succession. And he already knew a lot about succession because he had a colleague at Pittsburgh who was the inventor of succession. Now, that guy did most of his succession work on ocean sand spits and beaches. But it immediately seemed applicable, and it was applicable. So one of the things that Jennings started to understand there was the reason why you could walk a mile or two and see different zones, different sort of botanical zones, planting zones, and wildly different kinds of plants, ranging from plants you'd see at the edge of the beach to climax forest and prairies, was because of this process of succession. And using some help from his colleagues, and particularly his colleague who was the succession guy at Pitt, he went about the process of trying to identify the different ridges on Presque Isle and to date them geologically. Now, there's some controversy about his dating techniques. They weren't as sophisticated as they would be if we were redating these days, but they're probably pretty good. And he identified six different sand ridges, and each of these ridges would represent where the end of Presque Isle was at a particular time. So the ridges get younger as you go west, or older as they go east. And this is a chart of Presque Isle where he penciled in or darkened in the locations of the ridges here. And they range from just a little bit to the east of Waterworks, that would be the leftmost ridge, to almost the edge. Now, probably what's happened, although no one knows for sure, is that the process of succession has ended. Likely because in 1921 or 25, technically, when we decided how and where to run the roads to Presque Isle, we decided to stabilize the base and use filler sand so that we could count on the place where the road met Presque Isle to always be the same. Had we not done that, we might have had the problem of building a road to the base of Presque Isle and then finding that the road went to no place, and we'd had to redo the concept of getting a road onto the park. And that goes back to the fundamental decision that we made at the time that John Nolan was here in 1913 making recommendations. We made the decision at that time to engineer and maintain the engineered shape of Presque Isle rather than let it be natural. Now, what I did when I did the book is I did the next slide, which is a slide that shows exactly where those ridges are. And that's a little fuzzy, but you can see the 6 ridges and where they are with respect to modern features on Presque Isle, like, for example, the marina that was not there when Jennings started. And there's another ridge that essentially connects to the Lighthouse Keeper's Trail and the 3 ridges on the end. And I even identified and named the ridges slightly differently from the way that Jennings did. I connected them to modern features, which Jennings couldn't have done because those features weren't there. So on the next slide, you see that the ridges create zones. So what happens between the ridges as Presque Isle systematically grew to the east and got longer and longer. Now, here's just a quick note. When the French were here, they were interested in measuring Presque Isle. And we know from the French measurements, which were accurate, that Presque Isle has almost doubled in size since the time that they were here. They were seeing a sand spit that was 4.5 or 5 miles long at best in a low water year. Since that time, more ridges, more development. So we have these visually obvious ridges, 6 of them, and there are zones in between. We'll clarify the zones in a second. It's cottonwood seeds and new beech growth that drive the new ridges. And the process of succession is nonlinear. And this is what was confusing to everybody. There were people out there looking at Presque Isle and trying to figure out how it worked in the late 1800s and the early 1900s before Jennings. But what they noticed were the linear things that happened at Presque Isle. Like every year, the water level goes up and the water level goes down. It's highest in May and June and lowest in September and October. It was low in September when they tried to get the Niagara and the Lawrence out through the channel, which is why they had some difficulties, and they had to camel those ships up over the sandbars. And the process of succession, unlike the linear stuff, like fall comes every year, snow comes every year, warm weather comes every year, the sand ridges don't form every year. They form every several years, and we'll give you the details on that in a bit. But those are the things, those sand ridges, that have driven the growth of Presque Isle relentlessly to the east. Next slide. And here's how succession works. Every 85 or every 86.5 years, which is why we might not notice it. First of all, we need a low water cycle, and we haven't had many of those lately because we've had these high water cycles lately. Lake Erie seems to have long-term had a 30-year water cycle. So every 30 years or 31 years, the water peaks, and half of a 31-year cycle later, 15 and a half years later, it gets as low as it's going to get. And that's gone on since we've been recording this. Now, to be fair, we haven't been recording it all that long, just since the early 1800s. Now, those cottonwood seeds that you notice stuck on the new varnish on your deck, they tend to blow to the east or to the northeast with the southwest prevailing wind. And where they get to on Presque Isle, where there are so many of them, is to the water just at the end of the last beach. These days, that would be Thompson's Bay, where we go on wavy west wind days because it's so stable and so protected back there. So the cottonwood seeds blow out there onto the east end, and they sink into the water, and they become embedded in sand. And we've all noticed this as well. When we go swimming, you get in the water and it's deep, and then it gets shallow, and then it gets deeper, and then it gets shallower again. So there's two sets of sandbars. So the cottonwood seeds tend to collect, especially if we're not using the beach as a beach and tromping through the natural processes and keeping them from happening. They tend to sink and become embedded in the sand in the very first little sandbar that's usually 8, 9, 10, 12 feet offshore. September, when the water levels fall, if it's a particularly low water cycle, that little sand rivulet could come to the surface and become an infant ridgeline. So for a while, every 86 and a half years, there will be not one beach at the end of the peninsula, but two. The old one that was there, made out of sand, and the new one that had been underwater that has all this embedded stuff in it. The sun beats on that little sand ridge, that new sand ridge, and the cottonwood seeds, they don't pop up and become trees immediately, but they spread a system of roots and stabilize that little ridge, that new little ridge. And as that's happening, and there are now two beaches, the old ridge and the old beach and the infant beach, a new pond will form. So if you want to know the genesis of Presque Isle's lagoons and the connection between the lagoons and the process of succession, there's a pond between every set of ridges, like the oldest ridge and the second oldest ridge has a pond in the middle of it, and that pond is a lagoon. The young pond forms, and the infant ridge continues to grow and capture biological debris, including bits of dead fish and seeds that are flying around. Eventually, if we're lucky, every 86 years, the cottonwoods start to sprout and grow and totally stabilize that new beach. New slide, Ben. So here's the 6 ridges. 6 ridges that were formed over 519 years, according to Jennings. The Thompson's Bay Ridge, that's the youngest one, 1898. That was relatively new when Jennings got there in 1909, relatively new. Now, Jennings thinks that the second oldest ridge is really 3 ridges that were formed at 3 different times. No one has really argued against this, but the 3 dates that Jennings got by doing his dating were 1738, 1838, and 1858. And why those are 3 different ridges one ridge that are sort of interconnected, but not 3 different ones. It's a mystery to me, and it's a mystery to everybody that reads about this, but it seems that that's the way it is. The third ridge, which is visible if you walk the lighthouse keeper's cement trail from the lighthouse over to the bay side, it formed in 1684. So imagine this, the lighthouse, if you can think of the lighthouse where it is now, was at the very end of Presque Isle, or it would have been if they'd have built it in 1684, which of course they did not. Getting older yet, the Cranberry Pond Ridge, and that's the place where Cranberry Day happened. You'll read all about that in the book. That's Jennings Ridge 4, was 1594. The East Fisher Drive Ridge, that's the one that's on the opposite side, the east side of the newly dredged marina, 1429, not long before Columbus came. And the oldest ridge is the one that you'll see that's just east of Waterworks, 1379. So go on, Ben. Here's the zones between the ridges. So every set of 2 ridges has this going on between them. You'll get a sand plain between the infant ridge and the old ridge with a new pond, and the pond will get bigger for a while. Along that new ridge, you'll get cottonwood sprouts, American beach grass, and rocket launcher. Those are really hardy plants. They can have their feet wet. It can get to the water, can raise and then go down a little bit, and they'll survive. Then you get the dunes and the ridges and the more mature cottonwood trees. You get old ponds, which are our lagoons, marshes, and wetlands, and that's what's supposed to happen to the lagoons. Now, the fact that we have that nice set of lagoons out there that we all like to go and kayak and canoe through, that's a good and fun thing for kayaking and lagooning and fishing, but it wasn't supposed to be that. That was artificially created that way by the Pennsylvania Fish Commission when they were out there doing something that was environmentally disastrous. They went into those lagoons and they dug them all out, and they were trying to gate them and use them as an outdoor fish hatchery. More about that some other time. The 4th zone, as you move west, is thicket and scrub trees. These are trees that are kind of more stable than the cottonwood trees. It's trees like birch, aspen, and black cherry, and those are all over the place as well. And then finally, you'll get climax forest. And that's the place where you see oak, ash, and maple, and the great colors in the fall. So if you wonder where those spritz of colors are coming from in the fall, that's from the climax forest areas on the edges of the zones between the ridges. And of course, there would be 5. Now, there's a couple familiar Presque Isle ridges. You've seen them if you've driven out around Presque Isle. The one on the left, you'll see just to the east of Waterworks. This is where they've been rebuilding Beach 8. And that's a ridge that's probably 35, 40 feet tall. And it's taller than it should be because it's been enhanced by the Presque Isle Maintenance Department. Not that they particularly care about ridge enhancement, but in the winter, when the sand blows off the beaches during the vigorous northwest winds that happen in the winter and cover the road, the maintenance guys go out there with giant equipment and they push the sand back and then they push it back up onto the ridges. My favorite natural looking ridge, and this is the one that you'll see on the right, and this isn't a very good picture. You can't really get the perspective of this, but this is quite a tall ridge. This is in excess of 30 feet tall, and it's natural and it's curved. And if you take a look at the curves of any of these ridges, they're the shape that the peninsula was. The end of the peninsula was at the time that these ridges were formed. Now, here's how you can find your way to this ridge, and you've probably been there and seen it and not realized what you were doing. If you're driving around Presque Isle and you continue to the point where you have to make a decision to either go left along the lakeside and around by the lighthouse, or right onto East Fisher Drive. Now, there's two Fisher Drives. The West Fisher Drive was the original Fisher Drive, which leads out to the marina, and you can only go to the marina, or you could go to the channel that leads in and out of the marina, but then you have to turn around and come back. After they dredged out the marina in the 1950s, they rebuilt Fisher Drive, and they called the new one East Fisher Drive. So drive out to Presque Isle, bypass the road that you could take to the right to go on West Fisher Drive to the marina, and take the next possible right, as if you were going to make a sort of a circle around Presque Isle like you did during the lighting events of last winter. And just at the point where the all-purpose trail crosses the path, which would be just to the right of what you're seeing here, where you could park, if you take a look, you'll see this beautiful natural ridge, which it's curved and quite exciting. And if you're a bird watcher, you'll know this area because that's the place where everybody walks down the path toward the maintenance area to see the owls. So this is just to the left of the path you walk down to see the owls. You'll be walking along between the two ridges. So here's two familiar ridges and what they look like. And just to put things in perspective, if you were to get a chance to go across the lake and see the ridges on Long Point, they're like this, only they're taller, much taller. Go Ben. So eventually, Jennings built a field station at Presque Isle, and of course he wasn't comfortable doing this until Presque Isle became a state park. But you'll see there the academics as they looked, wandering around out on Presque Isle, cigarettes hanging from their mouths. That's before we knew that cigarette smoking was bad for us. Funny hats, butterfly nets. There's Otto Jennings in the middle with a smile on his face and a leather valise. And there's his wife, Grace, leading the pack. And to the left, you will see the building that Jennings built and generously shared with anybody that wanted to use it. He used it when he was there with his folks from Pitt, but the rest of the year he was perfectly happy to let, and he allowed Presque Isle State Park people to organize this for people. Gannon used it, Edinburgh used it, Clarion used it, everybody came here and used it. High school kids used it, high school teachers used it. There was nice programs out there. And that building that they threw together without a foundation lived out there, I think, until maybe 1960 or 62 or 63. They tried to move it and reuse it. However, I don't think it stood the test of time. The etymology of that building and where it ultimately went is part of the book. You have to buy the book for those details. Go ahead, Ben. He did create an environmental legacy, and it would be I would be remiss in not noting that there has been some academic criticism of Jennings, and from my perspective, and I've been a participant in this on both sides during my academic career, there was mean-spirited, nasty jealousy. So people get into academic departments, as I did, and as Jennings did, and people expect you to stay where you belong. They don't think you should be changing from a botanist to a guy that studies succession. So there was a lot of people, yelling and screaming about Jennings and how he misunderstood succession, and he wasn't really a succession biologist. He was a botanist. Like, from my perspective, who cares? You do what you do. And the important thing he did for Presque Isle and some other places in Presque Isle as well. If you get out your Google machine and Google Jennings in Pennsylvania and see all the things he did, he discovered prairies and identified them in central Pennsylvania. And what he did at Presque Isle was to change it from an overused place where people go to swim to a fantastic place to study biology and associated disciplines. When he got to the place where he built his field station, he decided to build his field station there because there had been several fires on Presque Isle, most caused by stupid people starting campfires that they didn't control properly. So there was a lot of missing forest area out on the end of Presque Isle, and he stuck his research station in the middle of it. And to protect that field station and the peninsula, he decided the smartest thing to do would be to plant trees. And see, since he'd had lots of experience around the firelands, and out there you'll see tons of fir trees crowding in on all these sand spits. They're probably not appropriate for Presque Isle. So he went ahead and planted them because he knew they would stabilize the sand. He was worried about Presque Isle being stabilized. And he wasn't so concerned about the possible planting of wrong species. And of course, maybe he didn't know maybe quite enough about that to decide what to plant. And we've done plenty of planting of the wrong trees at Presque Isle since his time as well. He generously gave a gift of the use of that station to Gannon. All my colleagues at Gannon used it. Edinburgh, my colleagues at Edinburgh used it, and other students. He trained hundreds of new biologists there, trained them in everything you can imagine, from pure old botany to succession and wetlands conservation, etc. He began the spirit of conservation at Presque Isle, and he carried that on in other parts of the state and also at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. I had a wonderful experience when I was out digging and doing research at Presque Isle. I just happened to run into some person that he created an academic position for. While he was working in central Pennsylvania, he was introduced to a young girl who was allegedly the most knowledgeable sort of local person with respect to plants. And as it turned out, she was a Mennonite person. And she started working with Jennings in the summer just to make money and show him what to see. And Jennings was so interested in her that he encouraged her to go to college. And her problem was that, of course, she had been homeschooled. She didn't have any credentials. She really couldn't get into a college. But he somehow figured out how to get her into Pitt. And she flew through Pitt in 2 years. And even though her family was not very happy about this, she continued and got a master's degree and a PhD and became a biologist, all thanks to the tutelage of Otto Jennings. Next slide. So the legacy of Otto Jennings today at Presque Isle is the Regional Science Consortium, which is a huge part of what happens at Presque Isle scientifically. And there on your right, we'll see my friend and colleague, Jeanette Schnars, who's the director of that, Dr. Jeanette Schnars, standing on the leaf, which is where the channel used to go through Presque Isle. That's the place that was knocked apart in a little tornado, apparently, a couple of years back, and rebuilt. And there she is, with a smiling face, doing one of the things she does the best, and that is directing biological and scientific studies. And one of the things that we're most concerned about, and our Jefferson colleague, Judy Lynch, has written about this, is the impact of harmful algae blooms. So one of the things we have at Presque Isle is a HAB lab. And one of the things we do with the students that visit Presque Isle to try to learn how to be junior biologists and good citizens of the world is to how to understand and study those harmful algae blooms. So there we go. Dr. Otto and Dr. Grace Jennings, thank you. Thank you for what you did for Presque Isle. It wouldn't be the place that it is today without you.
And Dr. Furr, I want to thank you for breathing life into their story and being able to help many other folks learn more about the life of the Jennings and their impact on Presque Isle. And I think that one of the things, as I stop sharing the slide, I'm going to pull the two of us back up so I can take a look at notes here as well. One of the things I think is important to acknowledge is looking at those dates and the fact that he is 42 years young when he arrives at Presque Isle and spends the next 40 to 50 years there. He's 88, I think, when he stops his tenure. How does he keep going through all of that, working into his late 80s, still fascinated with Presque Isle?
Characteristic of the academic disciplines. Academic disciplines seem to grab you. So I just give you a connection. My daughter is a marine biologist, and she got her start on Presque Isle. She went to Gannon. She played soccer there. She was an All-American soccer player there, if I could advertise for her, and a terrific biology student, and went off and did her graduate work at Old Dominion. But Stan Zagorski, who was her major professor when she was at Gannon, she still loves Stan and keeps in touch with him, took her to Presque Isle countless times, as did other Gannon College professors, Steve Ropsky notably. Steve Ropsky did his dissertation on squirrels. And one of the things that my athlete crazy daughter Cheryl could do for Steve was catch squirrels. So Steve would take Cheryl out to wherever he was going and say, Cheryl, get me that squirrel. And Cheryl would come back, with scuff marks all over herself and, skin ripped and stuff, and say, here you go, Steve, and hand him a squirrel. So Steve did squirrels, and Ken Anderson, who you may know, did bats. She helped Ken with his work, and that work lit her up. And all three of those guys, Stan Zagorski, Steve Ropsky, and Ken Anderson, while they're not young, they're all older than me, if you can imagine anybody. Not Steve. Steve's younger than me. They're still all fired up about their research.
And speaking of research, a couple of different times, Dr. Frew, you mentioned that his work was considered by some controversial, and I think that that's one of the things we began unpacking at the end. You began unpacking at the end that some might have looked at him to say he was not classically trained to study succession, but again, just to review that of why people viewed it as controversial at the time, and does that controversy still linger today, or if people come to terms with the style and way he was doing research and they acknowledge that?
Yes and no. It's so much fun and so easy to pick apart a publication in a refereed article or a refereed journal that you pay homage to, which is 35 or 40 years old, and be able to say, well, look, this guy didn't know how to carbon date. So me and my three friends went out to Presque Isle with our car, and we went and we took a few core samples, which we weren't really supposed to, but we did it anyhow, on one of those ridges, and we think his dates are off by 12 or 13 years. It's so easy to do that kind of stuff in retrospect, given modern technology, modern statistical techniques, etc. There was some of that at the beginning, but I think by and large, when you go out to Presque Isle and talk to the people who work there in the ranger department, the people that interpret the natural life of Presque Isle for people, Brian Gula, for example, they revere him.
And that's I think, again, going back to acknowledging when he arrived, 1 year after that fateful summer at Cedar Point in 1908, 1909 he arrives, and he's there until 1955. So he's working with the tools he has at the time, and so one might assume that the precision of science certainly gets better as the years go on, and we can refine that. So looking at a margin of error of a decade to 12 years is not unexpected, for this kind of work, and to pick it apart. It seems again, perhaps, I think you said earlier, mean spirited. How do we honor him appropriately? Do we do enough here in Erie, Pennsylvania? And does the state of Pennsylvania do enough? Because you acknowledged his contributions aren't just limited to northwestern Pennsylvania. He has a significant thumbprint on the entire Keystone State. So are we doing enough to acknowledge him here in our neck of the woods? And then is the state of Pennsylvania doing enough to acknowledge his contributions to wildlife and to nature?
Probably not. We should get to work on this. And if you would talk to Brian Gula, whose name is on the front of our book because of all the contributions he made, you can't talk to Brian Gula for an hour without having Otto E. Jennings' name pop up.
And friendly reminder for folks for that book, accidentalparadise.com. You'll hear me say it again at the end of this interview. But I think that is something that we can, perhaps as we look at the centennial celebration of Presque Isle being named a state park, ways to celebrate those who have helped the park come to life and the park to be what it is today, and how we study it and we appreciate it and we acknowledge it. Perhaps there should be markers or placards or things that we can observe. There are some, I believe, acknowledging his contribution on Presque Isle. Are there, Dr. Frew?
I don't know of a marker. You'll see all kinds of information about him inside the Ridge Center, inside Trek. And you'll see programs in which his name is honored and revered.
So if we somehow had the luxury of having a time machine and we could transport Dr. Otto Jennings here today to see what Presque Isle is, would you think there would be something that would stand out that would surprise or shock him, what he would find today if he were looking at Presque Isle, and what might he delight in? What might crack that smile we saw in that photo where he's hiking through with other academics and they're studying? So what would make him happy to see today where Presque Isle has gone and come? What might surprise or shock him if we were to bring him into today's Presque Isle?
I'm sure he'd be shocked by the traffic there. If anyone would have told him that there'd be a moment in time when 4 million people a year would be going on Presque Isle, and probably that Pareto thing, 80% of them go during 20% of the time. I don't even like to go to Presque Isle on weekends in the summer, but in the middle of the winter, sometimes I'll drive out there and walk on a trail, and we won't see anybody. And that would be the Presque Isle that Otto E. Jennings would remember. And he would be somewhat distressed by the political nature of how Presque Isle got started, with the Park and Harbor Commission trying to satisfy two gods. One, the god of the people that elected them. They were politicians, local politicians, by making the place a visiting and motoring arena. Motoring, you remember how fun that was supposed to be back in those days. He would maybe have been in favor of the Nolan idea to run the road over to the place where we just saw Jeanette Schnars standing. That's where Nolan wanted the road to hit, and to leave the park to take on its own natural shape. And he would probably be distressed by the fact that it was a dual goal at the beginning, to preserve the park and to let people enjoy it. He would have been more on the side of preserve the park than let people enjoy it. He might have been keener on the approach that they take. You would never be able to make this happen anymore at Rondeau, where you drive onto the park, and if you want to see the end of the park, you're going to do that on foot or as a result of the tram ride. On a positive side, he probably could not have imagined the work that the Regional Science Consortium is doing out there. They now have an annual, and they did it on Zoom this year, and I was a participant in that, an annual sort of show where they collect scientific papers in all disciplines, and they gather academics from everywhere and encourage people to do all kinds of work. I mentioned Ken Anderson. He's out there studying with giant microphones the flight of birds on the flyway going from here to Canada and back. He would have been more than pleased to see the bird banding work that's going on out there, and the people that are trying to capture some of the birds on their way back and forth and see what's happening, studying the warblers to see why 1,000 of them went north and maybe only 600 of them came back. And they have that kind of incredible data. And I think I might have mentioned to you that I was at the park when we were running the dress rehearsal for this. I was at the park walking with my wife Marianne, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and there I encountered a bunch of PhD students and professors from the University of Guelph who were at Waterworks studying purple martins. And they had binoculars and telescopes out, and they're looking at what the martins are doing in the martin houses and trying to figure out how many of them are jumping homes, and how many are sneaking the wrong eggs into the wrong cubicles for the female martins to raise, etc. And they were so generous to us. We introduced ourselves not as ex-academics. My wife was an academic as well, but as just people walking around, and they let us look through telescopes and binoculars, and it told us what they were doing. And when we left, we said, "Is there anything we could do for you?" And one of the guys said, "Well, only if you know factor analysis," which of course I do, or I did then. I'm not so sharp anymore. But a couple days later, they were at our house eating Italian food while I was, designing factor analytic studies of what they were doing with the birds. And the stuff they were doing on Presque Isle was so incredibly sophisticated that you cannot believe it. And it's the same kind of stuff that Ken Anderson is doing in cooperation with a couple of ornithologists from Penn State and a couple of ornithologists from the epicenter of ornithology, that's Cornell. All kinds of great things happening out there. And if Jennings could see that he was the guy that started that, I think he would be really pleased.
I was going to say, what a positive note to end on, because if there's a legacy to be had, one that says one has created something that brings so many people together that have a common interest in nature, but to be able to talk, from animals to plants to the recreation to so much more. What a legacy and what a story and what an experience you had there, Dr. Frew. So if we can, let's end this installment there, reflection on the life of Dr. Otto Jennings. Featured in Accidental Paradise, the tremendous book that you've done that it is available for sale and purchase at Trek, which we've acknowledged, and also available online at accidentalparadise.com. But Dr. David Frew, a JES scholar in residence and co-author of Accidental Paradise, a 13,000-year history of Presque Isle. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and taking the time, energy, and effort to talk about Otto Jennings, Dr. Otto E. Jennings, with us, the life and legacy he leaves, and the impact he's had on Presque Isle. Thank you for sharing that.
You're so welcome, and thanks for having me.
And of course, absolutely. And of course, a big thank you to the many folks who have helped this project become a reality, including the Tom Ridge Environmental Center Foundation. For more information on how, where, and when to purchase Accidental Paradise, the 13,000-year history of Presque Isle, please visit the Trek Foundation's website for that book, accidentalparadise.com. And of course, thank all of you. Thank you, you tuning in at home, watching these digital programs from the JES, whether you're tuning in real time or streaming on demand later, catching this episode. These programs could not happen without you. So a big thanks to you for tuning in. And a friendly reminder, folks, to stream other JES digital programs on demand, head over to our website, jeserie.org. There you're also going to find details about upcoming programs, as well as a wide range of publications, from quick timely reads to reports to essays and more, all available free to download, including Dr. Frew's On the Waterfront series. Great reads there, many of them. Check those out. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.